It seems you barely beat the sun.
Now, to be honest, a virtual community is like being a chef and you've got 3 ingredients to work with as opposed to 30. You know, it's not as easy to prepare a delicious meal, but you can still prepare a meal, and you can still depending on the 3 ingredients, you can still do a pretty reasonable job of that meal.
One thing that I've found very useful is in talking about depth, Andrew, you know, I don't want to jump on a phone or jump on a video call to answer questions that athletes themselves can go out and find themselves. So it's just like, how big is your school? So we just compared recruiting to toilet paper. All right. Andrew, what do you have to say about that?
I think that is, that's, yeah, pretty on the head.
We good?
It seems you barely beat the sun.
So on today's episode of Cor-row, episode 3, lucky viewers and lucky listeners, we're going to be talking about recruiting. So speaking a lot to the junior class of what do we do in this kind of state and the time that we're in of how do you stay relevant? How do you stay engaged? How does that influence kind of the college search experience? And you're going to be able to hear it from a couple different perspectives, from, you know, the club perspective, you know, lightweight rowing, open weight rowing, men's rowing, women's rowing. So you're going to be able to hear from a lot of different sources. We have Coach Nick Lee Parker on from Columbia, head coach of the lightweight men. We have Daniela, head coach of the Alabama men. We have Andrew Carter, head coach of the women at Iowa. And we have Ryan Sparks, the president of Sparks Consulting. So as you can tell, we've got, you know, the best and the brightest in the business right now, especially with Ryan's miming. So he's very much somebody who likes to talk with his hands, not just his mouth. So that being said, why don't we go through and talk about, just like in a very 1 to 2 sentence elevator pitch style, what do you see the biggest change in recruiting is going to be in this upcoming year? Nick, kick us off.
The most important thing is going to be personal connections to the coaches. It's going to be a little bit about how you row naturally, but the thing that's going to drive decisions is how well you connect with the coaches. That's going to let them know, like, hey, this person, I can get them on my team. We can work together and we can build something together.
All right, Andrew?
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. We're going to be certainly in a data void in the next little while as opportunities to row and train in a normal way have gone away. So I think those personal connections are going to be a big thing, and activities that speak to intent and drive are going to be big in developing those relationships with coaches. About we have to look in the crystal ball at the best of times, and I think you know, engaging in ways that demonstrate strong intent are going to be big.
Ryan?
I really think that if you bake a coach a pie and you send it to them, if you're going like 12 minutes on your 2K, that pretty much subtracts like a minute for every pie you send them. So cookies might do like 30 seconds. So if you're seeking strong relationships with coaches, think pastries. Pastries are are the right move right now. The only other thing I have to say is what the other 2 guys said is pretty much the case.
Do we have Daniela on?
I can provide any details on what kind of pie
Right.
we can spend some time on that.
If you have a nut allergy, be very aware, coaches. Don't open packages.
Wait, do we have Daniela on or no?
No.
No.
No. Okay.
Daniela, she's doing a
Daniela's
dissertation edit.
here. Yeah, I would kind of agree with that. I think the personal connection aspect is going to be pretty important. You don't want to inundate coaches with data, but you also don't want to leave things to chance. Because I think what we're all looking for is just consistency through communication, through messaging, consistency with what juniors are doing, and not just juniors in that class, but youth itself, and what you're doing from a day to day. So, with the idea of, summer rowing not being a thing, what are some options out there that we think people could take advantage of, or things that they can do, whether it's a group session or, like individual research? Like, where would you what direction would you point them in? And Ryan, we'll start with you first.
So we are starting to evaluate whether to adapt our camps into a virtual format, which I know, you know, it annoys me as much as it annoys you. You know, being on the water with other people is absolutely the way that we enjoy rowing most. But given safety and given COVID, you know, I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case. And as a result, the question is, how can you stay socially accountable to your team or to a group of people? How can you make friends in the sport, you know, versus, because I think that's what rowing is about for a lot of us. Like, it's not just about like sitting on the erg and pulling a lot of pieces. The question is, you know, do we get to know people? Are we making friends in the sport? Are we talking about the sport? Are we learning about the sport? And to kind of echo the recruiting point that was just made, a large number of recruiting conversations are going on around deep thoughts about rowing, because if there's no racing, then that's what recruiting coaches have to talk about, is basically, or what have to do is talk about rowing. And so I think a level of education is possible at this point, but also ideally a level of still of socially meeting people, even though it's in a random weird format, as we stay safe, is also possible. And I also think, you know, there's e-learning for coxswains available, but, you know, ultimately the motivated athlete, the one that's willing to kind of adapt to this situation, is going to get ahead as in any situation. And so it really comes down to being able to find that motivation, and part of that is social, no doubt. And so you need to hook in with the community. And we also, you know, I know that we're offering free Instagram workouts right now in order to serve that as well.
All right. Nick or Angie, you want to pop in?
No, you know, the question was where can they go and what should they be doing?
Yep. Where's a good starting place that you think that's easy enough or accessible that doesn't necessarily require too much thought?
Well, I think that looking at what's going on in a lot of collegiate rowing right now with teams taking some initiative among, you know, within the student ranks, that they're connecting using technology, you know, to maintain motivation and to maintain a sense of training norms. Again, like Ryan said, we all want to be on the water, and that would be lovely, but that's just not where we are right now. So we have to use other means. And I think that what people are doing, whether it's using, you know, platforms like Zoom or other things, they're congregating and they're keeping themselves moving forward with whatever means necessary. And I would encourage it in the junior ranks to do that. They're not restricted by some of the things that Nick and I are, where we can't orchestrate those things and monitor those things at the collegiate level. But I think junior clubs and high schools don't have those same restrictions. So I would encourage coaches at that level to use whatever platform they can access to group their kids and keep them training. And I would love to, you know, I'm just sort of thinking out loud right now. I don't know what NCAA restrictions we would run into. You know, as college coaches, we can visit and observe practices in real life. I wonder if that would be permissible in a virtual training environment. If junior club X had a training program where they were getting everybody together for a Zoom workout, and this kid had a bike and that kid had an erg and that kid was doing calisthenics or something, that we would be permitted to tune in on that if invited, just to observe work ethic and attitude and drive in the workouts and things like that. It might be an opportunity to gain exposure that actually might be logistically easier in some ways than us as college coaches getting out there and visiting programs.
I think those are all really good things, actually, really good ideas, because we have to be creative. Where I would start, I think if I was an athlete right now, junior athlete, or even a collegiate athlete, and I knew I wanted to keep rowing, I would do a standard SWOT analysis. I'd look at my strengths, my weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. I would do it for me. I say, okay, well, here's where I'm going well. Here's where I need to improve. here's some things that I see as opportunities, and then here are the things that could get in the way. Once you have those written down, then I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities that you can explore, and you can pick which ones are going to actually help me with strengths or weaknesses or opportunities. So I think all of the things that are said are great. And I would start with looking at which one of those is going to help me the most. And I'd make sure I'd done some deep looking to know exactly how to plan that.
I mean, a couple of things that were just used. I think both Ryan and Andrew used it, and then Nick, you kind of, it seemed like you were not in a bad way, but dancing around it. Is this idea of motivation? You know, we're talking about the athlete's motivation, but there's also a huge population out there that is also suffering from like the same challenges. Like as coaches, especially as Andrew alluded to in his last response, like, you know, we have a lot of restrictions as college coaches. You know, how are each of you finding motivation and, you know, keeping your team going or even keeping yourself going? Like I know for me, as the world knows, like I just transitioned out of coaching, but even like keeping myself motivated to still be able to be a support system for programs that I'm working with. One thing that's worked out for me is that, you know, you look at the end term goal and where you want to be once things do start to return to like some sort of normalcy. Then you can work back from there and recognize, all right, what brings you, like, what are your positive parts of the day? What are your negative parts of the day? But I think kind of reaching out to people in my network like this provides a big motivation, knowing that I'm not going through it alone. But what do you guys think? What's your motivation as coaches that keeps you going?
I think mine is, I don't find a lot of difficulty in that. And I don't, you know, honestly, I don't know if that means, or that's because I'm just like an old fart. You know, then perhaps not as susceptible as others are to some of these pressures. And or that I've just been at it long enough that the routine is part of what motivates me, is staying in the routine and always pressing forward. And I get a lot of motivation, honestly, from while the students might look to me for motivation, I get a lot from them. So we're in regular contact with our squad, you know, whether we're just having random catch-ups and nothing on the agenda, to actually having something that you know, information I need to get out to them. So a couple times a week at least, we're on a Zoom call, whether that's 10 minutes or 30 minutes. And I get a lot of energy that comes out of that. And they're really fun too, because while I'll call the meeting and I'll be the host, you know, I'll stay in there for as long as I need to be in there, and then I'll transfer the host over to one of the students, and then they all hang out with one another after I leave, which is really nice. But at the front end of that, where I get to be with them, I take a lot of motivation from that, because it reminds me of what it is that I'm doing here. You know, the only real change to my day is that I don't get to go to practice. All the other stuff that I'm responsible for, I'm still doing. So getting to see their faces on a regular basis, and to remind me why I'm doing all those other things, keeps my batteries charged for sure.
I would say my answer is very similar to Andrew's, but in a different way. In that, you know, I mean, what we really do as a company is focus on community and the way that community can help you grow as a person. And so, though we can't have a physical community and that's difficult, ultimately the mission stays the same. And it continues to be challenging people to grow in community. Now, to be honest, a virtual community is like being a chef and you've got 3 ingredients to work with as opposed to 30. You know, it's not as easy to prepare a delicious meal, but you can still prepare a meal, and you can still you know, depending on the 3 ingredients, you can still do a pretty reasonable job of that meal. It's just about becoming inspired enough to be able to work with those ingredients and work with them well. So in reality, it's just kind of utilizing, kind of being outside or you know, physical activity, at least for me, to inspire the level of creativity necessary to work with that level of ingredients, such that, you know, I can keep myself going by using those ingredients to create community, if that makes sense.
So in other words, you're kind of like a Top Chef, but on the show Chopped, is what you're saying.
Sure.
Or in a kitchen with Ryan and a box of Kraft macaroni and cheese.
Right.
He's just trying to decide whether he wants to put little pieces of hot dog in there or not, you know?
Which, you know, could turn over and change the meal in its entirety.
I tell you, the best ingredient right now is ghost pepper. That will change any dish. I tell you what.
Ghost pepper, mac and cheese, and hot dogs, but Kraft mac and cheese.
Ooh, and that would be good. That would be very good.
And I want you to know that clearly I'm bilingual because I was able to convert that into Kraft macaroni and cheese. And originally being from Canada, my instinct was to say Kraft dinner. But I changed that for you all, so you're welcome.
Thank
Well
you.
done. Well done.
Andrew, you'll be happy to know Jesse and I have started our tickle trunk.
Yeah.
See, that's exactly right. We started creating our own tickle trunk so that we too can have a part of Canada in New York City.
That's
What?
that's
Okay.
Do we
Mr.
want
Dress
to
Up.
educate those
For
who
the
don't know what a tickle
uninitiated,
trunk is?
that's for Mr. Dress Up. I met Mr. Dress Up in real life.
What?
Yes.
Sorry, it's a Canadian thing.
Please explain for the rest of us what that
Yeah,
is.
please educate the rest of us peasants that don't know what a tickle trunk is.
Mr. Dress Up was a children's television show. The character was Mr. Dress Up, played by a guy named Ernie Coombs, I think was his name. And it was a typical show, you know, their segment. It was a little bit like Mr. Rogers in a way,
Okay.
that type of a show. But one of the things was that they would have periodically, they would have a segment where they would dress up and tell a story or play out a story. And they would dress up and all the costumes were in this big trunk that they called the tickle trunk. And you would tickle it and that would unlock it. And then you would get all these various things in there that you could dress up and have fun with.
So Nick, you're saying that you're motivated by your own tickle trunk.
Yes, that is actually it. I'm motivated to complete. I want to graduate from a tickle trunk to a tickle closet. Like, let's have some real fun here.
Moving back to recruiting.
The way, Nick, what else motivates you? Besides, now that we've got the tickle trunk, tickle closet out of the way, you know, you've got some time to, you know, upgrade those. But what else motivates you to kind of keep going?
I think one of the things you get out of rowing and everybody experiences is you're halfway through a test piece or a race and you want to stop. You don't want to keep going. Like, it hurts. It's not going well. There's something else. And over time, you learn how to keep doing it. You learn how to keep going and you just keep deciding to go and go and go. And you do this so much that the very few instances where people have stopped, we all know about. We know about Lay Down Sally in the 2004 Olympics because an incident like that is so incredibly rare within our sport. It happens so infrequently. So the thing that keeps me motivated to go is my experiences in rowing and drawing on this thing of, like, I know I can do this because I have done these other incredibly challenging things. I have been at the 20-minute mark of a 40-minute test and wanted to die and finished it. And I think that's what keeps me going, is the fact that I've done it before. And I know that I can. And I know that in those previous times, it made me better. Getting through the end of the test, finishing the race, whether I was winning or losing, it made me really better. And that's what I expect out of this too. Like, this is going to make me better because of this. And if I can be better, then when I do get back to coaching, I do get back to be able to being on the water with the guys, I'll be better for them. And I can create a better environment so they can continue to grow and be better. That's what motivates me. It's knowing I've done it and knowing that by keeping on doing it, we can make things better.
You know, I would agree with that. I think that's an interesting, you know, train of thought. You know, I don't know with people that we work with and you know, and coach against, for that matter. You know, I think one of the things that we teach on a daily basis, whether we're doing it overtly or sometimes just it's inherent in what we do, is that progress is a habit. We're creating that as a habit. So is motivation always part of stimulating progress, or is it now just a habit that we've made part of our fiber?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we're always needing to be, and I don't feel that. I don't feel like I'm always needing to be motivated to do something. I'm just always pushing forward because that's my habit.
Right. And that's been ingrained in a practice behavior that's worked over time.
Yeah.
So you're not going to necessarily change that behavior when it's already so ingrained.
Yeah, and it's something that we hope that that we're imparting and instilling in those whom we coach, so that when they're in those times when the little devil is on their shoulder whispering those things that Nick was talking about, it's just an easy little off he goes, and he gets shouted down by your better angels.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about the high school athletes that are out there, I know that we talked very briefly when we first started of what's going to be important, but if we had to list off a couple things that for you personally feel strongly that athletes could be doing right now, whether they're seniors that are deciding on colleges, whether it's juniors that are contemplating committing early or whatnot, or even sophomores or freshmen, like what are three things that, like, it doesn't have to be three, but what are three things that people could be doing right now that would stand out to you? Whether it's, do you want to hear a text from them every day? Do you want to get on the phone with them for a certain amount of time? Do you want to see certain things? Like, what are little things that you would like from your athletes or recruits, I should say?
I'll jump in real quick on this.
Okay.
I don't think it's a matter of how often. I would be looking for more depth.
Okay.
So being able to have some depth to that conversation. So, show that you're not just saying I'm interested in your school just to say it, but what can you tell me? Like, why are you interested in this school? Why are you interested in this program? How do you see yourself fitting in here? So, I think that the really interesting, and I'll use the term recruiting, even though it's not usually part of my vocabulary. This process isn't, I never think about recruiting. To me is synonymous with sales, and that's not really the way that I see this process unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for lack of a better term right now, the most interesting recruiting processes that I've been part of have had depth to those conversations, where it's as much of that person, quote, recruiting, unquote, me, as I am doing at them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I am and I think that probably, Nick, you can identify with that, because Columbia clearly is not the easiest place to gain admission. So there's a level of selectivity that's necessary on both sides of the equation.
Right.
And so being able to really understand who this young person is, and that they have had enough depth to themselves to delve into that particular institution, that program, that roster, that coach, to see themselves in that roster with that coach at that institution, and how that's going to play its way out, how they're going to contribute, how it's going to contribute to them. Just so that, like I said, there's some depth to those things rather than just the scattergun approach that I think is very common.
I would agree with that. I think that when you talk about the difference in using terminology, like you don't use recruiting. When I was recruiting, I would try and get away from using the word process, but that was just my own perspective, because to me, a process is something that you would do over and over again. And as recruiters, certainly that's a process for us. Like, we're trying to figure out how we can do it more efficiently and effectively. But for the athlete and the prospect themselves, it was more of an experience, like trying to identify the right schools. But I think one thing that I've found very useful is in talking about depth, Andrew, I don't want to jump on a phone or jump on a video call to answer questions that athletes themselves can go out and find themselves. So it's just like, how big is your school? How big is your team, right? That's all standard information they can find online. I would rather have a conversation where they want to know, what the vision of the program is, like something that they can't find themselves. That's, I think, the conversation that I would want to have.
We see every year we have to kind of qualify. We are an objectively recruited sport, and at least in the initial iteration of recruiting. Academics and 2K. It's not like somebody needs to watch you, run a couple plays in a particular formation to to be able to figure out whether you're a great linebacker or not. And, it doesn't work that way. But then there's a secondary layer of recruiting that comes after that. We are a late start sport. As a result, there is emphasis on retaining athletes over 4 years, particularly at schools where admissions is essentially the best that can be done for that athlete insofar as securing them a place on the team. And as a result, coaches have always, particularly at better programs, looked at the character of the athlete insofar as their ability to commit for 4 years if given the privilege of being supported through the admissions process or given a scholarship. And I would say that those conversations insofar as looking at students' rowing IQ and looking at their kind of level of depth are occurring at a greater extent now than they've ever occurred before because of the amount of time that coaches have. And so I would say that, connecting that to the summer, what are you doing for the summer? If you're a junior right now and you're looking at how to kind of deal with this, the best thing you can be doing is, first of all, you want to be communicating with coaches at this point. But second, you want to be investing in your rowing intellect in any variety of ways. Those things will contribute heavily insofar as your conversations with coaches. So it's not just about like asking questions to ask questions to indicate interest, to make it through the recruiting process, to use that as a lever in admissions. It's about, there's definitely a level, like you won't succeed that way. You need to be able to understand a lot more about what's going on physiologically in the sport, what's going on insofar as the thought on rowing. And so you can be investing time. I talked to a recruit earlier today who's injured and wondering what to do. You can be investing time in the same way that coxswains invest a lot of time, which is watching a fair amount of YouTube. If you want to go that direction with it, there's any number of media pieces that you can begin to pull rowing information from, which then you can use as kind of fodder for that recruiting process. And I think parents need to understand, like, this is, I talked to a guy a parent who's a Goldman Sachs person, who told me that the recruiting process is more difficult than the process he went through to get an entry-level job in finance. And I think that's correct in terms of the level of understanding that's required, the amount of resilience that's required in a normal year. And given this year, it's even more so.
Well, that's interesting you say that, Ryan. As I listen to you say that about the entry-level position at Goldman Sachs. You look at, there's a wide variety of universities and university profiles that are sponsoring rowing, both on the men's side and the women's side, with different levels of rigor in their admissions process, like regardless of sport. But when you narrow it down into the rowing, I mean, everybody should be looking at it as the same sort of rigor as applying to a university with a 4% admit rate. Mm-hmm. Because there's that level of selectivity, and you have desire, all these other people have desire, you have talent, all these other people have talent. What makes you special? And I think being thorough on having a level of maturity and to spend the time, because we all do have a little bit of extra time. There's no commutes involved to practice or to the office and or to school or anything else. What are you doing with this time? Are you being able to provide depth to your sort of rowing resume or your rowing IQ, to use your term, and be able to carry a conversation, with Nick Lee Parker, if you're a lightweight man and interested in rowing at a high level?
Nobody carries a conversation with Nick Lee Parker.
That's not true.
Oh, I forgot that Nick was here.
I bet Nick Lee Parker carries a wicked conversation with Nick Lee Parker.
Hey. Nick, what would you say about that? Not true.
You are so
Yeah.
right, Nicky Parker. I know Nicky Parker.
Yeah. Isn't being right exhausting? Tell me about it.
I wanted to bring up two things as we kind of run down on time here, if you don't mind, Katie.
After you.
I wanted to bring up the lack of testing data, SAT, ACT,
Yeah.
which is a real problem. And I also wanted to bring up, I'm just going to make a blanket statement right now because I'm seeing this happening. We could talk about it, but in reality, like, we don't need to. If there are schools asking for early commitment right now.
100%.
In other words, that's going on in the recruiting process earlier than I've ever seen it in 10 years of doing college counseling in the recruiting process. I will go ahead and say that I believe that's a disadvantage to you as a student. Unless you absolutely 110% know that that's your first choice and that's been your first choice since you've been in first grade. We have 4 months of time where your 2K can come down. And as a result, your school choices could vastly change in that period of time. Coaches are not going to get angry with you if you choose not to commit now, particularly if your 2K goes lower. They're not going to want you less or move on to a different option. And I just want to make that public service announcement because it's important. I've seen that happening, and I don't feel that that's fair to students.
I'll pipe in from the women's standpoint. I think it is important to consider the fact that the NCAA legislation was changed and modified at the beginning of this year, where it was kind of predicted that the commit process and the recruiting cycle or experience, whatever you want to call it, was going to be earlier anyways. So even before, COVID really hit and everybody kind of stayed home, and then it seemed like more coaches started to ask about committing early. There was a lot of schools that had already been doing that since the fall. Bringing kids in earlier on junior official visits, like having kids commit. I think the earliest one that I heard was like November of their junior year.
We're such a late start sport that's not advantageous to anyone. It's not like their basketball recruits have been playing for 10 years. Like, they're going to improve an incredible amount between fall of junior year.
Right. But I think that's what we saw with the earlier start date, like being able to call it like rising juniors June 15th instead of, July or September 1st. Like, there was going to be a significant change in the way that recruiting was going to be handled. So I don't necessarily think it was just COVID, but I do agree with you, Ryan. I think that to try and put this pressure on these kids that are still learning how to make big decisions, they're still learning how to drive, right? To kind of predict their 4 years this early on, it's definitely different.
They haven't been in the sport long enough. Like, baseball players play the sport for 10 years. Maybe a sophomore year commitment makes sense for them. Maybe, to be honest, they still don't know who they want to be in college. I equate that to buying a ton of toilet paper at Walmart at the beginning of COVID. That's what I equate that to on the part of college coaches. Sporting.
Yeah.
So we just compared recruiting to toilet paper. All right. Andrew, what do you have to say about that?
I think that is that's pretty on the head. It's I think that I'm gonna sound critical for a moment of my own colleagues in college coaching. I apologize for that in advance, but I think that when people are rushing to put the pressure on to Ryan's point, it's very early in their stage of development. Given that we are a late entry sport, I think in the best case scenario, especially for domestic prospects, they're taking the sport up at the high school level. Even if they're freshmen in high school, that's still pretty late in the grand scheme of sport development. But the reality is that most people are even later than that. So even if it made sense from a strictly athletic perspective to pursue that candidate as an athletic prospect for your program, what troubles me a little bit is that we're divorcing athletics from the university a little bit. Like, we're losing sight of what we're doing here, which is we have a rowing program at this university because there's a university. It's not vice versa. I'm not bringing people here to be strictly rowers. They're coming here to be students who row. And I think any sport, even if it makes more sense, like Ryan's baseball example, that we can tell that this young man is going to be a great baseball player, maybe play in the major leagues. And we can tell that when he's 15 years old, maybe. I don't know, I'm not a baseball person. But let's say that's true. Is it still right to get a 15-year-old to make a decision on where he's going to go to university and get his academic experience? And perhaps even through that process, limit his options on what he can major in?
Mm-hmm.
When he's 15 years old, I'm the father of a high school senior. He happens to be a young high school senior, so he's 17. And and he's sure about what he wants to study. And I'm sure that he's going to take some classes that might change his mind, because I did the same thing in my day. So I just don't, I'm troubled by the divorcing of collegiate rowing from college.
Mm-hmm.
People would pursue these students at a time when they're not ready to make a decision about their future. They might be at a position to make a decision about their rowing, but about their education, their higher education and their future beyond, I don't think they're ready for that. So I think it's selfish and irresponsible, if I'm to be quite blunt.
Mm-hmm. I mean, at the end of the day, no one institution is going to be able to interchange the term student athlete. You're never going to become an athlete student, no matter, where you really are focused. Like, even if it is going into the NFL or, like the MLB, like, you still have to go through that educational process where a student allows you to be the athlete at that institution.
Yeah, I just know, again, if I put my parent hat on, which is, permanently on, and my son happens to not be an athletic recruit at the collegiate level, but if he was, I can tell you how fast I would pump the brake, how fast I would throw myself between him and a college coach who was at him at 15 or 16 years old. It would, I would hurl myself in between there, and I would slam the brakes on, like, whoa, if there was pressure being applied. I just don't think it's appropriate timing.
Nick, what do you think?
There's a big ethical question here about, like, whose interest are we serving? And it needs to be the students. It has to be them first. Coaching is a career of service. And so when I see behavior that is forcing someone who maybe isn't ready to make that decision yet happen, or I hear about it, that's upsetting. I would agree. I think there are students, as Ryan said, who are in their junior year and they say, I know I want to go to university. Why? That is my school, is where I've always wanted to go. And if I get an opportunity to early commit, I'm going to do it because I'm excited about it. For many students, that's not the case. And even for that student who knows that's what they want, it may not be in their best interest, but that's still their decision to make at that time. And so that's okay. So I think we need to just make sure that athletes are being given information. They're being allowed the opportunity to explore. Timelines or deadlines that kind of force things aren't being arbitrarily imposed. And coaches explain why there are deadlines. So there may be a deadline of, look, we have an early commit who wants to do it. Here's the scholarship money we have to do. Okay, so this means for another prospect, we need to know whether they want to come. And we could say that. We could say, look, we're looking at a situation for scholarship dollars. We could do this now. We will be interested in you if it doesn't happen after this time, but it may change our ability to offer you a scholarship. And that's what we don't want to get into. So being very clear about those things, because I know they play out in different ways, is really important. I think one of the things that gets lost is the reasoning behind why certain decisions are being made isn't always clear to the athlete. And coaches are going to have to accept that sometimes that means we're going to lose out athletes we know could make our program better. And that's okay. I mean, that's our mission is to get athletes here and coach them, teach them, build them up. And if you do a good job of that, you can make your team successful. It says a lot. If you're being threatened, it says a lot, because that's what it is. If you're being forced to do something, it's a threat.
Ultimatums never work.
Nah.
Well, I mean, as we
no good friendship works on an ultimatum, right? All good friendships, all good relationships, coaching and athlete relationships, they work together because you work well together and you listen and you respond and there's a level of respect. So anytime you're forcing someone to do something, I think there's a lot of concern there, especially when there's a power dynamic at play.
Yeah, don't say that or I'll never buy you another margarita again.
That's not true.
He means Shirley Temple, for those listening. He means Shirley Temple.
That's all we drink. Shirley Temples.
Well, I guess the last question, just to kind of wrap up, and it's more of a logistical question. Ryan brought it up, but with the lack of testing, both from like an academic and an athletic standpoint, the normal training cycles where athletes are doing 2Ks or, they're going to have race results, like getting that data, that's not necessarily going to be something that's directly available as it would be in any other typical year. And to also look at it from the academic side, like all of the standardized testing dates have been canceled until further notice. So, I mean, I'm going to put this more towards Nick and Andrew. How do you foresee that being a significant change from the coaching standpoint and how you consider a prospect?
Or do you want to leave this until next week? Because that's a big question.
It is a question, and I'd like to see how some things.
Daniela says next week. Yeah.
Next week.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll say that to next week. So I'll wrap up with this, just to give like athletes more information, like from college coaches and people who work on the scene. One word of a character trait that you want to see in a prospect. What is the one character trait that you value the most in any prospect? One word.
Insatiable.
Okay. Andrew?
When we combined it, Nick, wasn't that one word? Maturity.
What? Maturity?
Yeah.
Okay. Ryan, what would you say? If you had to give advice.
Humor with the U, like the British spelling of it.
Okay. I'd say curiosity. So
one word is hard.
What?
One word only is hard.
Absolutely.
Right?
But I would agree with all those words.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess like the notes from today would be, all right, be mature, be insatiable, have humor, and have curiosity. There it is. From the Corona crew on episode 3. Stay tuned for episode 4, where we'll dive into a little bit more about the logistics of, how we start to see the world changing in terms of evaluation, how coaches are going to think about data, how you can provide data. But until next time, stay safe out there.
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands.
Stay home.
Stay home.